watching people find themselves in the D4 space is really about, I did not imagine that I would belong in a space here, but now that I'm here, I cannot imagine not belonging and being a part of what is happening here. Because the synergy is you have to actually experience it in person to really understand how dynamic it is and what can come from it.
Greetings, my name is Manuela Arciniegas, Executive Director of Communities for Just Schools Fund, and this is our podcast, Beyond the Bell. Our podcast is committed to bringing you the voices, dreams, and brilliance of community organizers activating the public will for public education. Together, we will learn about how to support building a world where youth, caregivers, and educators are holistically safe, thriving, cared for, and invested in. We know our communities deserve to feel dignified, irrespective of their race, economic status, zip code, gender, and ability. Unfortunately, today's public schools are not yet safe places to learn, grow, and live for the majority of Black, Brown, Indigenous, trans, queer, two-spirit, disabled, or undocumented youth and their families. Yet, organizers around the country are working to build these safe and supportive systems and communities. But how do we get there? We are on the eve of what people are calling an AI and technology revolution. Despite the promise of technology to improve efficiency, advance learning, or be leveraged for improved health and economic outcomes, we know that the use of technology in our communities has often been wielded for surveillance, criminalization, and control. According to the Notice Coalition, youth data criminalization occurs when public or private actors use sensitive data like education records, biometric data, mental health records, related to individual youth and their communities to advance the prerogatives of law enforcement and carceral systems. Tactics include predictive policing, data sharing between schools and law enforcement, gang databases, youth risk assessments, and behavioral threat assessments. We know that many communities do not enjoy access or design power over how these technologies are used in the private and public sector. Today, we will hear from two brilliant organizers and entrepreneurs who are changing that reality, putting the power back into the people who hold a different vision for how technology can affirm human dignity and justice. Please welcome to our show the magnificent Marika Pfefferkorn and the wonderful Aasim Shabazz, co-directors of Twin Cities Innovation Alliance, or TCIA, a CJSF network partner. TCIA's mission is to build and develop a critical mass of diverse, highly engaged residents, policymakers, and entrepreneurs made up of people of color and others traditionally identified as end users and consumers of technology, innovation, and design, and transforming folks into the purveyors and beneficiaries of technology. A little bit about Marika. Marika is a co-founder, Solutions and Sustainability Officer, and Executive Director of the Midwest Center for School Transformation. Marika is a change agent working to transform systems and scale successes across education, technology, civic leadership, and entrepreneurship. And joining Marika is Aasim Shabazz, also co-founder and president of TCIA. Aasim drives innovative solutions to complex problems faced by communities and organizations. He is the chief architect of TCIA's annual Data for Public Good conference, a cultivated experience for meaningful contributions, co-powering, change-making, and relationship building in digital justice. Marika, Aasim, welcome to the pod, y'all.
Greetings. Hello.
It's good to be here, and thank you for hosting us.
Where are you all based right now?
We are calling in from the Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota, also known as the unceded territory of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people.
Fantastic. And so, Marika, tell us a little bit about the work you're doing to build community capacity, to build power, and advance education justice. And why is this important now? How does your lineage inform your approach to building power for schools and youth and families?
Thank you for this question, Manuela. It actually, as I was thinking about how this work has shaped me, I think about music and singing. And literally, when I was young, singing, I consider it was like one of my first youth development programs where I was connecting with other people. We learned how to sing, we learned how to perform, we went on tour. And I think about that developmental approach of people taking me under the wing. And I also think about my early childhood experiences where my first teacher was Native American and we were in circle and we were using restorative practices, although we didn't actually call it that. And to see how the arts and how restorative practices kind of show up in the world and how it shapes the work that we do has really been important to my journey in education justice. The work that I do to try to build community capacity and co-power with others to advance education justice, it's really important right now because we are actually facing the same issues that I was grappling with, my mother, my father were grappling with when I was young. So for me, the point of entry to education justice is the school to prison pipeline, the school to prison and prison nexus, or as we call it now, the school to prison algorithm. And that is like my brother was brought into the school to prison pipeline through special education and being misdiagnosed and getting pushed out. And then 30 some, 40 some years later, the same thing is happening to my friends' children as they're growing up in very similar education systems. And so what's important right now is that we need to recognize and acknowledge that history that we've had in education while also looking at the solutions that have kind of walked beside us as we try to address this as communities. And then also, it really stems from a collective approach to this work of what are young people saying? What are parents saying? What are community organizations saying? And how do we integrate that into the shaping of the work that needs to be done, the decision making that needs to be made, the refusals that need to occur, and the reimagining of what is it that we really want from our education? And that is to absolutely build power. I think of Octavia Butler, the quote, "The only way to deal with unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion." So my life, this work is charting a path that my ancestors have been on. And in collaboration with Aasim, as a co-founder, we have really been able to bridge a lot of the challenges with the opportunities that we bring from cultural, technological, just the backgrounds that we have with both of our families and communities.
Thank you for that, Marika. And, you described a little bit, and for the audience members who don't know about criminalization and the school to prison nexus, the disproportionate and disparate impacts that fall on Black, Brown, and Indigenous young people. And so often in our communities, our youth are pushed out. They are suspended and expelled at rates that are exponential compared to other children. And we see this legacy of discrimination and racism moved through the public education system, moved through public safety systems and approaches. And so now we layer on the role that AI and technology is playing to accelerate that. Aasim, tell us about your background as an entrepreneur and a specialist in data and technology, and how did your background bring you to supporting communities organizing for education justice?
Thank you, Manuela. That's a good question. And sometimes I have to ask myself that because I actually backed into it. I came in at a point where technology was seen as the golden age and there were a lot of barriers to entry. All you had to do was learn. And Marika and I worked in the African American Leadership Forum, which is really where we started working. And she was a part of the education committee and a part of PDIP and her work. And we actually had worked on a research project called Early Risers together at different points. And it was in that space that I actually started going back into public school systems, looking at research models and seeing how we coded the data. And so working with Marika and the PDIP Policy Design Implementation team, we started looking at how this cuts across silos. We came across Blue Line Coalition and other work, and we started to find out people didn't know a lot for projects that have been inception 20, 30 years before people ever heard of it. And then one day, the tipping point was smart cities. We design and support smart cities transformations. And I saw the technology that was going in and that the technology by its nature was to surveil. However, our communities were not at the table. And it was to surveil for parking and, making life's conveniences. But we call it the Trojan horse that keeps taking, because to make a profit, you got to start figuring out how to policing, because policing is a very powerful trigger when it comes to getting paid and making a profit.
Thank you so much for sharing how you started to notice the intersection of all of these different bodies of work, building technology, culture, profit, right? And that brought you to working back into schools and communities as well. And so, Marika, I saw that the Notice Coalition back in 2024 sent a letter to the U.S. Department of Education asking the federal government to ban the use of federal contracts for the purchase of technology that only increase surveillance and criminalization in schools. So can you tell me a little bit about what is a Notice Coalition? What's happening at the federal and state level around AI and technology in schools? In particular, what's happening in Texas and Chicago and these places that you and Aasim are deeply involved in building organizer capacity? And how does Notice and TCIA support communities to build the schools that they want and need instead of the replication of injustice that hurts the human rights and dignity of young people?
That's a really big question, Manuela. Can we do an entire series for the podcast? Let's start with the Notice Coalition. So really, the Notice Coalition comes out of the imagination of the Data for Public Good conference. Clarence Oko and myself had been working on local organizing campaigns, and we recognized that the work that we were doing on the ground was not translating across and between communities, and it certainly wasn't also reaching up to the national level about what was happening, how people were organizing and pushing back. And so we launched the No Tech Criminalization and Education Coalition as a marriage between what was happening between Pasco schools, Florida, and St. Paul, Ramsey County, and City of St. Paul Public Schools with the Joint Powers Agreement. And so we created the coalition as a place for us to connect with communities on the ground, be proactive about educating folks about what was happening, what was coming, equipping them with the knowledge, access, tools, resources necessary to self-determine in their communities, and then activating so that they can move campaigns both on the ground and that others could learn from them. And so we've been doing that for about the last 4 or 5 years. We're in almost our third iteration of our No Data About Us Without Us fellows, where we're supporting building community infrastructure on the ground with community organizers in education justice. So our most recent cohort of folks came from Houston, Chicago, and the Twin Cities. So really activating people on the ground to really raise this awareness, do the deep dive research and investigative work to know what's happening, and then work along beside and co-power with communities to address it. So that's happened. And from that work, we've been able to lift up some of our lessons. So we wrote recommendations to the Department of Education as they were considering and thinking about AI guidance for all of the schools across the country.
And why is that important, Marika? Is there existing AI guidance for schools? And why did you all feel the need to fill the gap in Texas?
So the Biden administration had provided state level guidance right at the end of his term that they were considering. That transitioned out as the new administration came on board. And so what we see is states across the country kind of doing their own piecemeal approach to having any type of guidance or policy in place. What the Notice Coalition does a really good job of is there were folks that were looking at what was popping up for AI guidance at the state level. But most of their fascination or their interest was around ChatGPT and other technologies that were being applied in the classroom. But they weren't looking at AI through a civil rights, a human rights lens. They weren't looking at it through a surveillance lens or a privacy lens. And so what the Notice Coalition did is scaffold more nuance into some of the work that folks have been doing at the Center for Democracy and Technology and looked at the language and the guidance in all 50 states around AI. We looked at 6 of the territories and we said, based on their ability to protect young people's civil rights, based on them not violating student privacy laws, and also just bringing forth a consumer surveillance culture in the schools, we really found most of the states are lacking. And so we were able to begin that process of looking at fundamentally what is necessary for a state at minimal to provide as guidance and protection. And then what do you want to add on to that to actually ensure that the policies that you are creating are not just consumer driven, but they are justice driven. And so we're working on the ground with Communities for Just Schools Fund and others to really think about how do you take that knowledge now, develop model policies, and really do a lot of that heavy lifting at the local and state level, since there is that absence of federal guidance at this time. So that is the work that Notice and Twin Cities Innovation does, is we translate, we research, we translate, and then we engage really with folks on the ground like, hey, we notice this is happening. What are you notice happening in your community? And so we've been really effective at building a movement, whether it is a youth, we call it an intergenerational movement, but we have strategies for young people, for parents and community members, but we do approach it through a community lens. So even most recently, we just had the inaugural National Youth Summit on Digital Liberation. And so we brought together young people from North Carolina, Virginia, Texas, Arizona, and Minnesota to really talk about with young people, what are you experiencing? What do you know? What is unknown? What do you want to do about it? Who's there to do it with you? And what are the next steps that we can take? So as Aasim often describes, we are a container and a space to bring people together to consider, to reflect, and to strategize, and then support them with technical assistance and resources, both at the practice level and the policy level, and coming with a solutions agenda, not just admiring all the issues that we're facing at this time.
I love that, Marika. And that's so powerful, right? So, Aasim, this year, part of the CJSF community is not just our organizing and movement building partners like you guys, it's also the donor community and the philanthropic community. And this year, Grantmakers for Education released their 2025 Trends in Philanthropy report, where they set some benchmarks. They survey their funders, and funders name top issues, opportunities, and challenges. And the number one issue that the 2025 benchmark study has named is AI in education, as both something that could have the most transformative impacts on public education. And so, let's take it down to the granular level. What did the young people say in your summit and in your work across the country around some of the both opportunities and harms that are associated with the way technology and AI plays out in their classroom, in their school, in their local district? Help me understand a little bit more about what communities are facing.
That's a good question. What communities are facing. I think they got it right that it's AI, but for us, it's AI, it's algorithm, it's predictive analytics. There's a lot underneath what we call AI. So AI becomes this catchphrase. Some of these technologies and patterns are, in the world of technology, are ancient, and they really are driving. Like the JPA was about predictive analytics, right? An algorithm that was matched up with data that was wrong, collected in error, that was considered to be biased, not considered, but was actually biased, have been proven in court, which means by default, all predictions made on it are wrong.
And what is the JPA, Aasim?
Oh, the Joint Powers Agreement. And that was what you see happening today, where a lot of organizations are trying to come together underneath the auspice of doing good for the community. And the Joint Powers Agreement is when organizations, government agencies that are originally supposed to be siloed in order to protect the liberties and the constitutional rights of others, right? To protect them, have agreed now to pool their resources, which, as you know, and we know from experience, I think, life experience, that that's too much power. That's too much lack of oversight from community members who need to drive the change. And so to say that it's AI, these are institutions that are driving for profit. And we have to look at it from that particular perspective. These are not community-driven initiatives that are driving for their public good, for their well-being, to solve problems at home. So we have two different models and two different mindsets and one has more money, more resources to solve a problem of gaining profit for things that they've created, versus communities who are lived experiences who are saying that these don't really fit. Yeah, it's fun to play with Chat GPT, but I'd rather have a good teacher, an education system, a quality of life system that promised me excellent outcomes that we have known and established, but have chosen strategically to break so we can create an opportunity for technology to come in. And I'm a technologist, so just keeping it, 100 on that. But we're human centered on who should be owning that technology, who should be shaping it. We like to use as an example for people as they say, well, what does that look like if community owns it? So we use in one of our data for public goods, we use Wakanda Forever in the way that Shuri interacts with AI. Still the critical thinker, still the problem solver, comes up with a hypothesis, and then asks a system to test it. Not a crutch, not dependent, but still honoring the legacy of human intelligence, making that original investment, community intelligence, making that investment, and then supporting technologies that come in to uplift that versus a tool being sold to communities that are in a plight that they did not themselves create, that policies created, disinvestment created, and the narrative around the lack of value in public education has continued to erode the faith in our teachers. So now we can position AI as a good teacher, which it is not.
Gotcha. And you're talking about like various levels that I hope, Marika, you can break down a little bit also. TCIA has had transformative victories, and I hear y'all mention this Joint Powers Agreement experience that you all were really instrumental in addressing. Can you talk about what happened? Can you talk about the dangers when different public systems share the data of all the people who come into contact with them and some of those harms associated? So what did it take to organize community voice and power in this example around the Joint Powers Agreement in Minnesota?
Thank you for that question, Manuela. It has been 7 to 8 years since we really organized as a community. And to Aasim's earlier point, this idea of this joint powers agreement or early warning risk system, as they framed it, was in play in 2014. Like that is when they started actually thinking about how they wanted to use cross-system data, have access to information about young people and their families that they would not previously had access to determine who was more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system, with the aim of preventing that from happening. But to Aasim's point, considering using data that was biased and flawed. So the way that I came into this early warning risk system, which I now recognize as predictive policing, was that I was organizing around discipline disparities on out-of-school suspensions. 43 school districts in our state had been identified for discriminating against Black and Brown children in the use of out-of-school suspensions. Then I hear this agreement between Ramsey County, the city of St. Paul, and St. Paul Public Schools that they said they were going to use that very data to identify who would be at risk. And they were adding other data points that are really interesting to consider when you think about what they actually tell you. So they were proposing using criminal histories of parents and siblings. They were thinking about using free and reduced lunch. They were thinking about using attendance. And if you look at all of those things in isolation, you have to ask, what does that tell you about the people? And what it tells you is that you might have a target on your back, and there is a judgment in place that is not acknowledged, such as free and reduced lunch. What does it tell you? Other than having a free and reduced lunch is that you might live in a community that has been disinvested from. What does attendance tell you? It might tell you that there's not enough supports for childcare, or that it might tell you that there's an experience in that school system that is not giving a sense of belonging to that young person. But how you interpret that data determines how you see that young person. And if those are all the factors that are looked at through a deficit-based lens, what you have is more people scrutinizing Black and Brown children through a deficit lens and using the technology as a guise to say we could actually do something about it. Because even though they collect that data and analyze it through an algorithm, what they have not provided is a new solution to address persistent issues, such as absenteeism and the other things. And so what we see is they're bringing in this technology to kind of confuse or fog the topic, but it's the same topic. And on the other side, the technology doesn't actually solve for it. So when they were proposing the JPA, they were saying, what we'll do is we'll send a social worker out to the school afterwards with a list of resources. That was already happening. So you're potentially criminalizing more young people and their families. You're not coordinating more resources, and budget is actually being taken away from what other solutions have been demonstrated to be useful and productive, and what the community has asked for. So in that question, I think we see that happening again and again, where school districts are sold a bill of goods that technology is going to be an easy solution to address COVID with GAMGO, student activity monitoring, or vape detection technologies. We have a public health crisis. Let's use vape detection to get our kids out of the bathroom. But these are all technological solutions that often do not have any type of research or evidence base. And it is, again, putting hyper surveillance on the particular issue, but not addressing the root cause. And that is one of the biggest challenges that we face, is this divestment in education from human resources to technological resources that are unvetted.
Yeah, and I think the challenge we're seeing, like in this current context, right? This is all continuing to happen under this new administration, which has recently taken severe actions, right, to defund public schools, to destroy the federal Department of Education, laying off staff, cutting federal funding to states. Most recently, the big, beautiful bill, in quotation, has cut SNAP funding, which provides free and reduced lunch for children, has cut Medicaid funding, which is really a large funding flow for mental health counselors in public schools. It's also cutting at catastrophic levels of professional development that teachers need to be able to meet the evolving needs of our young people in schools. So in this context of destroying public government, of defunding public schools, we see a deep investment in criminalization infrastructure like ICE and police. And so while we notice this is a trend, to your point, Aasim, the tech is the tech, but the people who design with the tech and how they analyze the data, the information, the tools, how they analyze and collaborate or not with communities, we're going to get similar approaches, policies, and outcomes. But you all are doing a lot to change that. And so can you tell us a little bit about the Data for Public Good conference and what it means to create containers in communities where young people, educators, families, entrepreneurs, scholars, artists are coming together to put the design power back in the hands of people to build systems and communities that are more of what they want. So how does D4PG do that? And how are you navigating these intersections around this political context and the future, Afro-Native future that you all often talk about we should build?
That's a good question, especially today, I think, as we think about what is the imagination, right? And the D4 PG, we call it the D4 experience now, because data tends to, people try to figure data, how does that relate to me? When everything around us, information, is at its base data. And whoever can monetize that, meaning take it out of context, they have a lot of power when you can take data out of context, information out of context. You can frame a whole different narrative. What Marika and I, when we set out and listened to communities, the JPA, and also from a technology standpoint from tools, we start with the community without tech. It's not a tech solution. It's not a tech-driven solution that we're aspiring to. We're coming at it from a human perspective, our community perspective. So we look at HI, human intelligence, CI, community intelligence, as you invest there. If you invest there, then technology designs start to become a co-powered endeavor. And so in big tech and companies who build products, there's always a product manager. Not always, mostly. There's a role called a product manager. Our intent is that communities become the product managers, like they usually are, designing solutions for tools, for problems, and experimenting. The difference is there's no R&D budget in communities.
What is R&D?
Research and development. They don't get to experiment and make investments and make mistakes and come back and, okay, let's try this now, improve the recipe. That's what we call the algorithm when we started working with communities to break it down with the algorithmic improv. They don't get that. And D4PG creates that container, and what we call it co-powering. Understand the history, anchored in the present with momentum towards the future. And we educate, equip, and activate our communities. And so by they go through this process, we look at imagination as the key component in deriving solutions beyond a reaction to. Because if we keep reacting to, we'll never get the futures we want, because the reaction to is not a natural phenomenon. It is something that's being pushed. And so let's take this space, and D4 does that with artists, comics, some wannabe stand-up comedians, that would be me, but who come in, and educators, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and it's across that, because this is who lives in community. Right. And these are the people who have real invested interest in the health and well-being of those. And what does that mean to be sustainable? And a lot of solutions, Manuela, are local contexts. They don't initially scale. What's happening in Alabama is, or let's say Montgomery, Alabama, to be more local. In that school district is different what is happening in the Bay Area, Oakland, California school district. But there may be learnings and patterns that we can synthesize. D4PG serves as a platform for people to come together to synthesize that. So whether you're an educator, whether you're an abolitionist, whether you are for or against, we're like, no, this is a both and what about space. And that what about space gives us the opportunity to co-power, to co-design, and come together and work. And so that's the intent. We want you to come in with different perspectives. We're not looking for a groupthink situation. We want this dynamic tension of creativity that will allow us to align to the futures that we want. And Afrofuturism, indigenous futures, what you see is a pattern that is inclusive. It is inclusive in the way that it includes differences, the way that it includes nature as an underlying framework or principle. It doesn't outstrip the capacity of nature to support it. Man-made systems tend to do that very well. And thus we have a disproportionate amount of harm being done to our systems, our human systems, and our environment. So we have to bring them all together to solve this as a community. So.
Can I just add that we bring them together to break down the silos also? And I think you have expressed that, but like one of the activities we did this year was a warm data lab where we, again, all these different folks come together that don't really interact with each other on a regular basis. And so how do you even at the most minute level break down that tension between groups that are not in space together? You spark their curiosity. You ask them questions that are out of their context. And so that warm data lab that we did is the question that we asked is, what is risk in a changing world? From the lens of family, from the lens of media, from the lens of history. And then they have conversations with that. So from the very moment you step into the D4 experience, it's about breaking down barriers and silos and bridging conversations with folks that are very reluctant or don't have the opportunity to be in space. Aasim actually shared a story with me about he goes to a lot of the trade conferences. And in those spaces, he intentionally seeks out folks that are looking for something a little different, a little more, not just to be in line with the vendors or getting the next contract, but they're looking to build that community. And Aasim brings them back into this community. And so watching people find themselves in the D4 space is really about, I did not imagine that I would belong in a space here, but now that I'm here, I cannot imagine not being belonging and being a part of what is happening here. Because the synergy is you have to actually experience it in person to really understand how dynamic it is and what can come from it.
And I'll say this, Manuela, I think it should not be lost of the role that organizations like Borealis and CJSF play in helping bring, because of that national reach that we have as a collective community, of being able to listen to the feedback at the community level and find those in a way who want to be there and don't even know they should be there. It's like, you don't know you should be there, but we're going to support and invest in you going there. Building communities of practice is what D4PG is about. The Notice Coalition came out of that. There are other coalitions and work and partnerships that come out of that, that we are lifting up, that comes across. And so I think that this is a movement, like a groundswell fabric, the tapestry, the texture of what it means to be in community. That liberatory spirit is in this space, so we're doing it together. So we want to note the orgs that help support that, because it wouldn't happen without the investment in people, investment in experimentation and solutions, and a container to do that, a platform to do that.
Manuela, are you going to be mad at me if I do another Octavia Butler quote?
No, I love
to
her.
that?
Please.
Okay, so this whole conversation is resonating with me about this D4 experience and container. We can each of us do the impossible as long as we can convince ourselves that it has been done before. And so being in that space with each other reminds us every day that this has been done before and that we can do it again together.
Yeah, and that it's our human right to connection, to be invested in each other's well-being and survival. And what I love about the D4 PG space is you all are actually building, funders, we have our funder talk and it's not always very helpful, but like the cross-sectoral collaboration that we need. What is that? That's neighbors with multiple sectors, jobs, experiences, races, economic status, lineages, seeing each other as part of one community and interdependent fabric. And so I would love to ask you guys, because actually busting these silos that we see as lightning rods in our political reality right now, we've gotten really good at separating people, at doing identity-based politics, at saying there's us versus them. And that is the linchpin of what's happening in the agenda around our current administration and the experiences that our folks are going through in communities. And you all are really leaning into the muscle to bridge, to connect, to help support people seeing each other as a bigger we. And so we don't always do that super well in our sectors, not in philanthropy, not in organizing. And so I would just invite from you advice for organizers and movements, and advice for funders. What should we start doing, stop doing, slow down doing, so that we can get better at building these kinds of broader coalitions and networks and collaborations?
Well, that's a powerful one. And sometimes it's counterintuitive. Marika and I talk about this from time to time because, you don't realize you walk in with a certain hurt or a bias because of your experience, and righteously so, where you may harbor and hurt that you may carry it out that allows you to dehumanize another group, even within the movement space. We become survival of the fittest unknowingly, our way, or if you're not with us, you're out. And it's like, no, that's not how community works. Community is shades and textures, a gradient of joy. And so coming from that space of hurt doesn't always get us to where we want. It may serve as a catalyst to start us, but moving to what that space of joy looks like. So even when we are associating, I think the buzzword now is tech bros. Well, there are people working in tech spaces that don't earn that title. And so how do we start to, have those shades of where our imagination, where we're calling to those with a vision that's compelling and activating to the vision of what we want for healthy communities? And a long time ago, MJ and I, we were talking, Marika, about this as education is a point of entry that most of us in America has gone through. It is a common shared experience, whether you went to public, private, or whatever, where we got orientated to what our perceived roles in the world would be and how much we could imagine what we could do. And today, it's now based on the job. Back in our day, our parents' day, education was a power. It was a liberatory tool. It was a mandate to go through this, to achieve this for our community and for yourselves. And I think that as we start reactivating our imagination on that frame, right, on what is the power of this space and the futures that we want, not what we're reacting to, and then work back to what does it take from me as a host in this space, not an owner, as a host with other hosts to make this a welcoming space for all those who come in, and how we continue to advance and grow that visions, because they're more than one, as we have different communities and see ourselves in it. So that's what I would say. Activate that imagination, have conversations that say, hey, what do we imagine this can be like? Not in relationship to this current administration, because that may send you over here, but what we know, what will we want to go, what we want for our children and for our communities to experience.
Asserting our agency and painting the world we want first, and not in a reactionary agenda. And what about you, Marika? I mean, it's really important and beautiful to hear you talk about building the capacity of people to plug in, right? What do you think what might be your advice for movements or for funders or for anybody listening who doesn't know anything about education justice? What should we start doing, stop doing, slow down doing?
That's a nice list of items. So I'm just going to focus on one that I just see as an interruption to our progress. And that is this focus on individualism versus collective. And I think that is embroiled in identity politics. But one of the things that organizers of the past really did a good job was of thinking about for the culture, for the people, and how do you bring that forth? And I think with the onset of social media and all these other spaces, the voice has become much more individualistic versus collective. And so it's much easier to co-opt the narrative that we are trying to build, and it has more bickering and infighting than proactivity around creating those worlds that we want for ourselves. So I don't think folks understand how individualized our language and our approach has become, and decentering the cultural practices and ways of working. Um, for me, the integration of art at this time has been one of the most powerful ways to give voice and speak to our times. And so,
Yes.
with the No Data About Us Without Us Fellowship, we did not go into our fellowship thinking, we're going to teach everybody about technology and art is going to be the way that we solve it. But what came out of it was the creativity and artistry in the people. And so we had an art exhibit about anonymized portraits of folks that were experiencing technology, vape detection technologies. And one of our fellows is doing an exhibit. They're doing that exhibit in coffee shops where they're not having conversations about education or technology. So
Hmm.
it's breaking into spaces that they're not even having the conversation. And then one of our artists in residence for the No Data About Us Without Us Fellowship worked with the fellows as they were learning about education and technology and created a giant puppet show that is going on tour. And so that puppet show speaks to the elders in the community. It speaks to our history. It speaks to young people. There's poetry, there's rap, there's music. There's everything that you can think of that is kind of that fabric and thread that can bring people together. And so again, when our approach is singular, we are absent the opportunity to bridge art, music, political study, all of those pieces together. They're so segmented and separated that we're missing out of a lot of our opportunities to ground ourselves, to be rooted in the solutions. And look at the ways that we've done this, storytelling, all of this for so long, and like really bringing that back into the fold and not separating technology from the arts. And so even breaking apart the word STEAM, because art is not just one of the words in the science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. It is central and core across the board. And so, again, breaking down those silos, resisting an individualistic approach, and really looking to the collective way of being with each other, I think is actually, in this time, revolutionary.
I love that. And it's like expansive, right? Let's lean into the multiplicity of gifts that come from our lineages, from our communities, from our ancestors to solve for the now and the future we want to build. Right on, y'all. So I just want to wrap with asking you, what is your call to action? You know, in this podcast, our audience is very diverse. Some folks are all the way in movement, all the way in social justice philanthropy. Some folks are in other spaces. So what do you all want to invite the audience to do right now if they want to plug into your great work, into the work that's needed in their local communities? What's one action that they can take?
One of the ways that we talk about this work is, what is your point of entry? Whether it's you're a parent of a young person in school, you're an educator, is what is your point of entry that connects this to you? And then answering that question, where are the spaces that I can find that can answer that curiosity? So the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance hosts a book club. Like, if this is something that's new to you, join us in our community as we navigate in conversations using literature as a way to break down the world around us and have great conversations with each other. I think that's one great way. I think another great way is the D4 experience is coming in 2026. So hop on that bandwagon and either support us, join us. No, it won't be an either. It's a both and what about? Become a part of the D4 experience. We have the D4PG conference, but there's so many ways over the course of the year that you can do that and bring it into your own community. So we're looking to partner with people And we're looking to bridge this work because we cannot hold it by ourselves. We are not intended to hold it by ourselves. So, what is your talent and gift that you can bring to expand this work and be a part of this movement? Aasim, what do you have to say about that?
I think this building off the momentum, having conversations, one, do not confuse this as a right or left issue. This is a quality of life issue for everyone in our country, and people tend to model their patterns after us. And so make this issue about your community, your family, and imagine what does that look like from a positive, healed perspective. Imagine the opportunity, and then how do you show up in spaces, right? Imagine beyond the current crisis, because that can consume all of our energy, right? And sometimes they are designing crises to absorb our attention because they have the resource to plan and implement 5, 10 years out. So let's build out that idea infrastructure, the imagination to drive our desire to manifest it, and make that our manifest destiny, that we are going to co-power the futures that we want, and then figure out how to plug in here, plug in anywhere in the community. So you got the Data for Public Good, you got the book clubs, you got probably conversations in coffee shops. Just start having small conversations about, imagine that. Imagine if, imagine when, imagine how, what does it take for us to do that? What do I as a host need to give of myself to make this a better world, to make this a better place, and step out the hate flow? Because that hate individualistic flow is what's fragmenting the idea that there's a social contract. There is a social contract. There is collective agency amongst us to do the good that we intend. And then finally, stop watching the news. It's disrupting our creative flow. And so reconnecting with people and get the news from them and educate them on, hey, you know what? There's hope and there's a possibility, and let's do that. Let's do that thing.
Thank you so much, y'all. That was Aasim Shabazz and Marika Pfefferkorn from Twin Cities Innovation Alliance, giving us their pearls of wisdom around how to move the needle to advance education justice and build the civic engagement and governing power of young people across the country. You heard their action steps and their invitations to you. I'm all here for the Good News newspaper. When's that coming out? I want some good news every day. Thank you so much, y'all, for being with us. We really appreciate you. Blessings on your continued journey. That was Marika Pfefferkorn and Aasim Shabazz from TCIA, sharing their long history of work flagging the role and impact that technology has traditionally had on low-income communities of color. Tech, unfortunately, has historically been wielded to accelerate surveillance and criminalization in our communities, enabling an anti-human rights agenda on an uneven playing field between Black and Brown youth, parents, and corporate billionaires who hold deep ties to the federal government. In response to that, TCIA has cultivated a powerful community of organizers, entrepreneurs, and Afro-Indigenous futurists who believe tech should instead be a tool that is community-owned and deployed in service of just and thriving communities. TCIA has always played a role as movement forecasters, and they sounded the warning years ago that corporate tech's outsized influence in schools and government necessitated philanthropy to invest deeply in organizers' capacity to rebalance the scales of power. As organizers continue to connect the role that tech plays across campaigns on education justice, corporate accountability, immigration, and climate justice, we need to fund organizations that work intersectionally across these issues to meet the scale of the challenges these communities are facing. Thus far, as a philanthropic sector, we have failed to do so. So how do we get back on track to support organizers as they continue to tilt the scales of power and insist on safety, protection, and civil and human rights for all of us? It is by investing deeply now. We recorded this conversation with Marika and Aasim at the end of July 2025. We're now releasing this episode in early 2026, and the federal government has since then deployed ICE agents to major blue cities like Chicago, Portland, Los Angeles, and all across the country. They've relied heavily on the use of surveillance technology to identify potential sites for ICE raids, to demand local police and government collaboration, insisting that these departments and government agencies give up private data on citizens, such as their voter registration rolls. Check out the follow-up episode, part 2, where we invited Marika to come back and give us an update on what's now being called the Minnesota Rebellion of January 2026. This episode will appear on this feed in a few days. In the meantime, please consider supporting TCIA at www.tcianm.org. Kindly click like and share our podcast and donate to our CJSF Partner Network. Thank you to CJSF's donors and organizing groups, to Phil Circus, our wonderful podcast producer, and to you, our community of champions and supporters. Stay brave and stay strong. Thank you.